But the point I would really make is that Ukraine and Georgia were too far. This is right up against Russia. This is in the context of the complete destabilization of the nuclear framework. This is in the context of the U.S. putting in missile systems on Russia's borders. If you listen to President Putin over the years, probably the main thing, if you listen carefully, that he's concerned about is missiles 7 minutes from Moscow, is a decapitation strike. And this is very real. The U.S. not only would freak out, but did freak out when this happened in the Western Hemisphere. So it's the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. And fortunately, Nikita Khrushchev did not stand up and say, open door policy of the Warsaw Pact. We can go wherever we want. Cuba's asked us. It's none of America's business. What Khrushchev said is, war, my God, we don't want war. We end this crisis. We both pull back. That's what Khrushchev and Kennedy decided. So the most important thing is stop the yelling, stop the warmongering, and discuss with the Russian counterparts. And don't beg to be at the table with the United States. You don't need to be in the room with the United States. You're Europe. You should be in the room with Europe and Russia. If the United States wants to join, that's fine. But to beg, no. I have no doubt of why Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia wanted to join NATO. The question is, what is the U.S. doing to make peace? Because NATO is not a choice of Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, or Slovakia. NATO is a U.S.-led military alliance. And the question is, how are we going to establish peace in a reliable way? And by the way, Europe does not need to have Ukraine in the room when Europe talks with Russia. You have a lot of issues, direct issues. Don't hand over your foreign policy to anybody, not to the United States, not to Ukraine, not to Israel. Keep a European foreign policy. This is the basic idea. If I were making those decisions back then, I would have ended NATO altogether in 1991. When those countries requested NATO, I would have explained to them what our Defense Secretary, William Perry, said, what our lead statesman, George Kennan, said, what our final ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, said. They said, well, we understand your feelings, but it's not a good idea because it could provoke a new Cold War with Russia. So that's how I would have answered it. When those countries joined in the first wave, I don't think it was that consequential, in fact, except that it was part of a bigger project. And the project was spelled out already in 1994. There's a very good book by Jonathan, Harvard University Press, called Hubris, which gives a detailed historical documentation of step-by-step what happened. And it's really worth reading. So this is the real consequential. Russia even swallowed, with a lot of pain, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. It is Ukraine and Georgia. And it's because of geography. It's because of Lord Palmerston. It's because of the First Crimean War. It's because of the missile systems that this is the essence of why there was this war. I've lived through every administration. I've known these presidents. I've known their teams. Nothing changed much from Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump 1 to Biden. Maybe they got worse step by step. Biden was the worst in my view. Maybe also because he was not compos mentis for the last couple of years. And I say that seriously, not as a snarky remark. The American political system is a system of image. It's a system of media manipulation every day. It is a PR system. And so you could have a president that basically doesn't function and have that in power for 2 years and actually have that president run for re-election. And one damn thing is he had to stand on a stage for 90 minutes by himself. And that was the end of it. Had it not been that mistake, he would have gone on to have his candidacy, whether he was sleeping after 4 p.m. in the afternoon or not. So this is actually the reality. Everybody goes along with it. It's impolite to say anything that I'm saying, because we don't speak the truth about almost anything in this world right now. So the decision was taken in 1994 to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine. This is a project. This is not one administration or another. This is a U.S. government project that started more than 30 years ago. The idea was that there would be Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia as the Black Sea littoral that would deprive Russia of any international status by blocking the Black Sea and essentially by neutralizing Russia as more than a local power. Brzezinski's completely clear about this. And before Brzezinski, there was Mackinder, and who owns the island of the world owns the world. So this project goes back a long time. I think it goes back basically to Palmerston. So this project began, and we had a continuity of government for 30 years, until maybe yesterday, perhaps. 30 years of a project. Ukraine and Georgia were the keys to the project. Why? Because America learned everything it knows from the British. And so we are the wannabe British Empire. And what the British Empire understood in 1853, Lord Palmerston, is that you surround Russia in the Black Sea and you deny Russia access to the Eastern Mediterranean. And all you're watching is an American project to do that in the 21st century. In 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote The Grand Chessboard. That is not just musings of Mr. Brzezinski. That is the presentation of the decisions of the United States government explained to the public, which is how these books work. And the book describes the eastward enlargement of Europe and of NATO as simultaneous events. And there's a good chapter in that book that says, what will Russia do as Europe and NATO expand eastward? And I knew Zbigniew Brzezinski personally. He was very nice to me. I was advising Poland. He was a big help. He was a very nice and smart man, and he got everything wrong. So in 1997, he wrote in detail why Russia could do nothing but accede to the eastward expansion of NATO and Europe. In fact, he says the eastward expansion of Europe, and not just Europe, but NATO. This was a plan, a project. And he explains how Russia will never align with China. Unthinkable. Russia will never align with Iran. Russia has no vocation other than the European vocation. So as Europe moves east, there's nothing Russia can do about it. So says yet another American strategist. Is it any question why we're in war all the time? Because one thing about America is we always know what our counterparts are going to do, and we always get it wrong. And one reason we always get it wrong is that in game theory that the American strategists play, you don't actually talk to the other side. You just know what the other side's strategy is. It's wonderful. It saves so much time. You don't need any diplomacy. Lots of important things are now on offer and on the table, and I believe that the war will end quickly because of this, and this will be at least one blessing in a very, very difficult time. Exactly what the settlement will be, I think, is now only a question of the territorial issues. And that is whether it is the complete 4 oblasts, including all of Kherson and Zaporizhia, or whether it is on the contact line and how all of this will be negotiated. I'm not in the room of the negotiations, so I can't really say more, but the basis will be there will be territorial concessions, there will be neutrality, there will be security guarantees for Ukraine, for all parties. There will be, at least with the U.S., an end of the economic sanctions. But what counts, of course, is Europe and Russia. I know the Russian leaders, many of them quite well. They are good negotiators, and you should negotiate with them, and you should negotiate well with them. I would ask them some questions. I would ask them, what are the security guarantees that can work so that this war ends permanently? What are the security guarantees for the Baltic states? What should be done? Part of the process of negotiation is actually to ask the other side about your concerns, not just to know what they know as you think is true, but actually to ask, we have a real problem. We have a real worry. What are the guarantees? Well, I want to know the answers also. By the way, I know Minister Lavrov, for 30 years. I regard him as a brilliant foreign minister. Talk with him, negotiate with him, get ideas, put ideas on the table, put counter ideas on the table. I don't think all of this can be settled by pure reason because of oneself. You settle wars by negotiating and understanding what are the real issues, and you don't call the other side a liar when they express their issues. You work out what the implications of that are for the mutual benefit of peace. I think that there are, and maybe there will be, a restoration of nuclear arms negotiations, which would be extraordinarily positive. I think that there are tremendously important issues for Europe to negotiate directly with Russia. And so I would urge President Costa and the leadership of Europe to open direct discussions with President Putin, because European security is on the table. Okay, I mention all of this because you need your own foreign policy. I issue a report, 2 reports each year, one, the World Happiness Report, and 18 of the top 20 countries, if I remember correctly, are European. This is the highest quality of life in the whole world. So you need your own policy to protect that quality of life. The United States ranks way down. And the other report, where's my colleague Guillaume? He's somewhere in the room. Here, there he is. Guillaume Lafortune is the lead author of our annual Sustainable Development Report. And almost all of the top 20 countries are European countries because you believe in this stuff. And that's why you're the happiest, except in geopolitics, but quality of life. So you need your own foreign policy, but you won't have it unless you have your own security. You just won't. And so, and by the way, 27 countries cannot each have their own foreign policy. This is a problem. You need a European foreign policy and a European security structure. And by the way, although Michael assures me it's dead, I was the greatest fan of OSCE and believe that OSCE is the proper framework for European security. It could really work. Europe stands for lots of things that the United States does not stand for. Europe stands for climate action. By the way, rightly so, because our president is completely bonkers on this. And Europe stands for decency, for social democracy as an ethos. I'm not talking about a party. I'm talking about an ethos of how equality of life occurs. Europe stands for multilateralism. Europe stands for the UN Charter. The U.S. stands for none of those things. You know that our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, canceled his trip to South Africa because on the agenda was equality and sustainability. And he said, I'm not getting into that. That is an honest reflection of deep Anglo-Saxon libertarianism. Egalitarianism is not a word of the American lexicon. Sustainable development, not at all. You probably know, by the way, that of the 193 UN member states, 191 have had SDG plans presented as voluntary national reviews. 191. 2 have not. Haiti and the United States of America. What I would do, by the way, is buy European production. Because actually, strangely, weirdly, unfortunately in this world, and it's a truism, but it's unfortunate, so I'm not championing it, a lot of technological innovation spins off from the military sector because governments invest in the military sector. So Trump is an arms salesman. You understand that. He's selling American arms. He is selling American technology. Vance told you a few days ago, don't even think about having your own AI technology. So please understand that this increase of spending is for the United States, not for you. And in this sense, I'm completely against that approach. But I would not be against an approach of Europe spending 2 to 3% of GDP for a unified European security structure and invested in Europe and European technology, and not having the United States dictate the use of European technology. It's so interesting. It's the Netherlands that produces the only machines of advanced semiconductors, extreme ultraviolet lithography. It's ASML. But America determines every policy of ASML. The Netherlands doesn't even have a footnote. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Hand over all security to the United States. I wouldn't do it. I would have your own security framework, so you can have your own foreign policy framework as well. The Biden administration wasn't even allowed to say sustainable development goals. The Treasury had a policy not to say sustainable development goals. My first recommendation, with all respect to Brussels, is move the NATO headquarters somewhere else. I mean it seriously, because one of the worst parts of European policy right now is a complete confusion of Europe and NATO. These are completely different, but they became exactly the same. Europe is much better than NATO. In my opinion, NATO isn't even needed anymore. I would have ended it in 1991. But because the U.S. viewed it as an instrument of hegemony, not as a defense against Russia, it continued afterwards. My own view, again, with all respect to Michael, we only had a brief conversation about it, is that Europe basically should have its own foreign policy and its own military security, its own strategic autonomy, so-called. And it should. I'm in favor of that. I would disband NATO, and maybe Trump is going to do it anyway. Maybe Trump's going to invade Greenland. Who knows? Then you're really going to find out what NATO means. But the confusion of NATO and Europe is deadly, because expanding Europe meant expanding NATO, period. And these should have been completely different things. So this is the first point. So I do think that Europe should invest in its security. 5% is outlandish, ridiculous, absurd, completely absurd. No one needs to spend anything like that amount. 2 to 3% of GDP, probably under the current circumstances. So the NATO enlargement, as you know, started in 1999 with Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic. And Russia was extremely unhappy about it. but these were countries still far from the border, and Russia protested, but of course to no avail. Then George Bush Jr. came in. When 9/11 occurred, President Putin pledged all support. And then the U.S. decided in September 20th, 2001, that it would launch 7 wars in 5 years. And you can listen to General Wesley Clark online talk about that. He was NATO's Supreme Commander in 1999. He went to the Pentagon on September 20th, 2001. He was handed the paper explaining 7 wars. These, by the way, were Netanyahu's wars. The idea was partly to clean up old Soviet allies and partly to take out supporters of Hamas and Hezbollah. Because Netanyahu's idea was there will be one state, thank you, only one state. It will be Israel. Israel will control all of the territory. And anyone that objects, we will overthrow. Not we exactly, our friend, the United States. That's U.S. policy until this morning. We don't know whether it will change. Now, the only wrinkle is that maybe the U.S. will own Gaza instead of Israel owning Gaza. To please understand, as grown-ups, what this is about. Military events are costly. They require equipment, training, base camps, intelligence, finance. That comes from big powers. That doesn't come from local insurrections. South Sudan did not defeat North Sudan or Sudan in a tribal battle. It was a U.S. project. I would go often to Nairobi and meet U.S. military or senators or others with deep interests in Sudan's politics. This was part of the game of unipolarity. So this project went on from the 1990s, bombing Belgrade 78 straight days in 1999 was part of this project. Splitting apart the country when borders are sacrosanct, aren't they indeed? Except for Kosovo. That's fine, because borders are sacrosanct except when America changes them. Sudan was another related project. The South Sudan Rebellion. Did that happen because South Sudanese rebelled? Or can I give you the CIA playbook? But the idea has been around at least for 25 years. It actually goes back to a document called Clean Break that Netanyahu and his American political team put together in 1996 to end the idea of the two-state solution. You can also find it online. There were moments where there were disagreements and very, wonderful disagreements, especially in the last time of significance was 2003 in the Iraq War, when France and Germany said we don't support the United States going around the UN Security Council for this war. That war, by the way, was directly concocted by Netanyahu and his colleagues in the U.S. Pentagon. I'm not saying that it was a link or mutuality. I'm saying it was a direct war. That was a war carried out for Israel. It was a war that Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith coordinated with Netanyahu. And that was the last time that Europe had a voice. So this was the mindset, and the decision was taken formally in 1994 when President Clinton signed off on NATO enlargement to the east. You will recall that in February 7th, 1991, Hans-Dietrich Genscher and James Baker III spoke with Gorbachev. Genscher gave a press conference afterwards where he explained, NATO will not move eastward. We will not take advantage of the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. And understand that was in a juridical context, not a casual context. This was the end of World War II being negotiated for German reunification. And an agreement was made that NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. And it was explicit, and it is in countless documents. And just look up National Security Archive of George Washington University, and you can get dozens of documents. It's a website called What Gorbachev Heard About NATO. Take a look, because everything you're told by the U.S. is a lie about this. But the archives are perfectly clear. And I spoke with European leaders then, and they were very clear, and it was quite wonderful. Europe lost its voice entirely after that, but especially in 2008. Now, what happened after 1991 to get to 2008 is that the United States decided that unipolarity meant that NATO would enlarge somewhere from Brussels to Vladivostok, step by step. There would be no end to eastward enlargement of NATO. This would be the U.S. unipolar world. If you play the game of Risk as a child, like I did, this is the U.S. idea, to have the peace on every part of the board. Any place without a U.S. military base is an enemy, basically. Neutrality is a dirty word in the U.S. political lexicon, perhaps the dirtiest word. At least if you're an enemy, we know you're an enemy. If you are neutral, you're subversive, because then you're really against us, because you're not telling us. You're pretending to be neutral. The United States came to the view, especially in 1990, 91, and then with the end of the Soviet Union, that the U.S. now ran the world, and that the U.S. did not have to heed anybody's views, red lines, concerns, security viewpoints, or any international obligations, or any UN framework. I'm sorry to put it so plainly, but I do want you to understand. When the Soviet Union ended in 1990, the view became even more exaggerated. And I can name chapter and verse, but the view was we run the show. Cheney, Wolfowitz, and many other names that you will have come to know literally believed this is now a U.S. world, and we will do as we want. We will clean up from the former Soviet Union. We will take out any remaining allies. Countries like Iraq, Syria, and so forth will go. And we've been experiencing this foreign policy for now essentially 33 years. I tried very hard in 1991 to get help for Gorbachev, who I think was the greatest statesman of our modern time. I recently read the archived memo of the National Security Council discussion of my proposal, how they completely dismissed it and laughed it off the table when I said that the United States should help the Soviet Union in financial stabilization and in making its reforms. And the memo documents, including some of my former colleagues at Harvard in particular, saying we will do the minimum that we will do to prevent disaster, but the minimum. It's not our job to help. Quite the contrary, it's not our interest. In my understanding of the events that have befallen Europe in many contexts, and I'll include not only the Ukraine crisis, but Serbia, 1999, the wars in the Middle East, including Iraq, Syria, the wars in Africa, including Sudan, Somalia, Libya. These are to a very significant extent that would surprise you, perhaps, and would be denounced about what I'm about to say. These are wars that the United States led and caused. And this has been true for more than 40 years now. What happened, more than 30 years, I should say, to be more precise. Europe has paid a heavy price for this because Europe has not had any foreign policy during this period that I can figure out. No voice, no unity, no clarity, no European interests, only American loyalty.